So it's 1998, and British Olympic cycling is in a crisis. They have no medals to show for all of their efforts for the past 80 years. In fact, they only have a single gold medal for the time between 1924 and the time that they happen to find themselves, which is close to the year 2000. And if you are a product manager for a company like this, you're not that excited, right? You've got no fans, no funding. The companies that make money from your activities, the broadcasters, hate you. So things aren't that good. So what do? You hire this guy who looks like a British thug, but he's actually an ex-professional cyclist who did an MBA and fell in love with the idea of continuous improvement. Not just continuous improvement in its academic sense, but how does continuous improvement act as a cultural change agent? David Brailsford joins around 1998 and starts to change very, very small things at British Olympic Cycling. And these changes have a pretty dramatic effect. So the next Olympics was Sydney Olympics, and they managed to win a gold medal. And then 4 years later, 2 medals. So that's a pretty big increase there. Then Beijing, out of the 10 available gold medals, they get 7 of them. And then they repeat it again. And more recently, they've been able to do almost the identical kind of performance. This one was slightly more disappointing, except they did have a consolation prize of 4 silver medals and 2 bronze medals. Those were counted for anything. So for your data, well, the data viz nerds here, I made it pretty for you. This is a pretty big impact, right? In these kind of 4-year cycles, which are long cycles, their release turned out to be a pretty big release. Then Brailsford, who's now Sir David Brailsford, turns his attention to the Tour de France, which is one of the most spectated sports in the world. It's a three-week event. And this is kind of like the pinnacle of cycling. This is where this is the big game. And over the years that he was involved in the team that he was managing, a team called Sky, they took just about all the yellow jerseys, which is the winning prize for the Tour de France. And it's kind of amazing that such a simple idea, this idea of continuous improvement, should affect this kind of, or may have this kind of effect on a team that had, up until then, done pretty poorly. So over the last 4 years, I've spent my time not only working at Vegetable Soil, but traveling around the world, visiting companies that do things at a high performance. And I'm particularly looking for teams that are in the product space that are performing better than their peers. What are they doing differently? What are they doing that nobody else is doing? And what is the mechanic behind that? What's the physics behind what they're doing? So as Martin mentioned in his introduction, myself and Nate Walkinshaw, is Nate here? No, there he is. Nate and Martin and myself, we wrote this book called Product Leadership. And essentially what we did is we looked at what these companies are doing differently and how can we take those lessons and share them with the rest of you. And if you haven't read the book, I encourage you to do so. We don't make any money out of it. Or the little money we do buys us a coffee. So it's really not an economic pursuit. It's a labor of love. But in this time that we spent visiting all these companies and hearing them tell us their stories, we came across this idea that they're somewhat different from all the other companies in that they think about themselves pursuing that continuous part of continuous improvement in an infinite way. They don't think about themselves pursuing short-term goals. They're not thinking about next quarter. They're not thinking about that NPS score. They're not thinking about some small goal. They're thinking specifically about being a brand or being part of somebody's life that is it has no time. It's timeless. And this idea actually is not a new idea. This guy, James Cass, wrote a book called Finite and Infinite Games, and it's essentially a game theory book. And in this book, he describes that finite games are these familiar contests. It's like a football game. You've got a finite set of rules, you know who's going to be there, and you play for a certain amount of time, and then you're done, and then you will go home. But the infinite games are much more mysterious because you're playing for the sake of playing. And that's what we found at these extraordinary companies, is that they are playing for the sake of playing. They love the game. They love being excellent. They love being good at their craft. They're not just doing it to get that NPS score. They're doing it because they can't think of anything else to do. This is what they were made to do. So in part 2, I want to talk a little bit about how you start to structure that space. How do you make a space for that to happen? We've heard a lot from our speakers today about psychological safety. There's a way to test psychological safety. And a guy called Peter Skillman, who's an engineer, came up with this interesting idea called the Marshmallow Test. Who's heard of the Marshmallow Test? Yeah, a lot of you have heard about it. It's a really interesting study where you give people a certain amount of stuff. You give them some raw spaghetti, some tape, string, and one marshmallow. And the only rule of this particular game, or this test, is that you have to build the highest possible tower with the marshmallow on top. That's the only thing you have to do. And what most people who've heard about this test are struck by is how good kindergartners are. Or maybe they're struck by how bad MBAs are, but either way, it's still the same thing, right? Nobody expected the MBAs to do well. What's interesting about the kindergartners doing well is that they don't have any skills at building stuff. And most people say, oh, this is just because, they're more willing to experiment. And yes, that's true. But the thing that happens in these environments with kindergartners is that they are reacting to another dynamic within teams that's a lot more powerful than just this idea of experimentation. Yes, experimentation is super important. But experimentation can only happen when you're feeling like experimentation can happen. And if you're an adult, what you do is you spend most of your time worrying about what everybody else is thinking. So you're managing for status. You're managing for who's in charge, who's going to make the next decision. Is there somebody who's more senior than me? Does somebody have engineering experience? Should I defer to that person? And this dynamic changes the way that you behave, and it reduces your ability to experiment. So if you want a safe psychological place, you have to create that environment. Now, we are unfortunately living in an era where the hangover of this kind of business or this kind of corporate environment still infiltrates our day-to-day activities. We still think like this. Somebody has the answers, and they will gladly lay down that interest, those answers to us, and that will pass on to the next person, until eventually somebody does the work. Now, fortunately, we are a little bit more mature these days. We start to look like this incredibly staged stock image. We're all incredibly well-dressed. We look like hipsters. But this is a lot more realistic. We're trying to interact in a team environment. Our structures are less hierarchical, at least in desire, than they were maybe half a century ago. But the problem is that as lovely as this idea is, it doesn't scale very well. We still need some hierarchy to help us with asset management and resource management and talent acquisition. Where are we going? The vision, the mission. We need a little bit of direction. We can't have everything just be just a crazy amalgamation of people. So when it comes to structuring teams that live in a safe psychological space, you have to choose very carefully. And the most important thing you have to choose is different people. This is counterintuitive, right? So you have to choose as diverse a group as possible. Not just diverse in terms of race or gender, but diverse in terms of backgrounds, experiences, understanding, knowledge. Because when we choose people that are different to us, they give us the signal that it's okay to be different. If we're all the same, and it's very difficult to differentiate between us, if we're all white males, then we start to differentiate by things like who's in charge. So this idea that we can create safe psychological space by diversity might sound counterintuitive, but it's correct. And this is what we witnessed in the companies that we visited when we went around and visited them and wrote our book. What happens is, in these diverse groups, you get a lot of sharing because people have to share. They're different, so they have to share. They're not the same, so they don't feel like people understand them or know them. So they're encouraged to share. They're encouraged to say, hey, this is why I think my ideas are different. It's imperfect sharing, but it's better than having perfect communication with a bunch of people who are identical. Furthermore, is when you want to put these people into a team, it's better to co-locate them. Most people don't want to hear that. I own a company that is entirely distributed. All my team is spread around the world. So I don't like the fact that co-located teams work better than my team do. But that's the reality of it. Why? Well, because we're human beings, and we like seeing each other, and we like touching the spaces around the work that we're doing, and interacting with each other is really important. We also want to speak the same language. Now, when I say language, I don't mean English or French or German. I mean the language of jargon. Jargon either allows people to have the same conversation, or it keeps people out. And so it's very important to develop a language in these teams where they can communicate freely with each other and avoid those communication barriers that cut that down. And so we witnessed this when we went to see these companies, when we visited them. They were very eager to have the teams develop ways to communicate within those groups. And they would spend a lot of time having those teams relate to each other, share stories. And this led to building their own values. So even teams were able to build their own values that were separate from the company values, or at least were in line with those company values. And probably the most important value, which we've probably heard a dozen times today, is this one: being vulnerable, being open. Right? Actually, you mentioned this yesterday in the leadership forum. Being vulnerable means sharing stuff about yourself that then creates a loop where somebody wants to share with you. And what's really amazing about being vulnerable is that if I share something about myself and you don't share something back, I know you're not my people. Right? It's an instant feedback mechanism. I've opened myself up to you, and you haven't opened yourself up to me. We're not going to be friends. It's a very, very clear way to communicate, and it's binary. It's very binary. The other thing that needs to happen is these teams need to be organized around another human being, and that human being is your customer. Teams are never organized in these high-performing companies around metrics. They don't organize them around that NPS score. They don't organize them around some kind of entirely quantitative metric. These are humans that they are organizing other human beings around. So that when they do need to blend together to solve a problem, they're all solving the problem for this other human, this other persona that they can have a relationship with or an understanding to. If different teams have different metrics and then they have to come together to solve a problem, it's very difficult for them to do this. One of the challenges that these teams have, even these co-located, diverse teams with lots of interesting human beings on them, is that between them, they aren't always going to be working on the same project. And that's when I think Emily mentioned you can have these silos forming. Well, in progressive companies like the company that Nate and Gil work at, Pluralsight, is that they do deliberate, they form deliberate bands of members around either domains or interests, just like I think Emily called them communities of practice. And these can scale across an entire organization. What's really cool, though, is when these multi-layered companies, which have this hybrid hierarchy plus team makeup, is that they start to form teams across these organizations where teams are doing things for specific purposes. So at Pluralsight, they do this thing which you can read in more detail, a book called Team of Teams by Stanley McChrystal. The US Army discovered this in the same way, in that you take emissaries from each part of the organization and you bring them together around an idea. What is that idea? It might be, in this case, an OKR. Hey, we're trying to achieve this goal. Let's all get together. Let's get some time with the senior executive and let's figure that out. You don't have to be on the same team. You just have to be solving a problem. And in the US Army, they needed to do this because during the Iraq War, there were teams from the CIA, from the FBI, from the Army, from the Navy, and they weren't talking to each other. They were operating independently of each other. And so these emissaries, or these diplomats within the organization, were meeting to create a team of teams, a secondary layer of teams. You can even have teams around gender. So at Pluralsight, they have women in Pluralsight. And the women in that organization get together on a regular basis and create another safe psychological space where they can share. And this is an incredible recruitment technique, right? If you tell somebody, hey, we've got a team that looks after this particular gender issue, or is thinking about this kind of particular OKR, or this idea, or this philosophical idea, those things start to become networks within networks, and they recruit people from outside the organization. It creates that psychological safety that you're looking for. So psychological safety isn't just a buzzword, it's a deliberate, intentional structuring. It's a strategy of structure. Now I want to talk a little bit about what happens when these teams have been structured. What happens when they're together? What are they signaling to each other? And I want to go back to the cycling team that I was mentioning earlier, the Sky British cycling team. When Sir David Brailsford took over the team, he started to implement this idea of continuous improvement, just like he had done at British Olympic Cycling. And the press got hold of this, and they called it marginal gains. Now, anybody who's done any basic mathematical stuff will know that marginal gains is not something you can apply to humans. I can't say to you, hey, we're going to increase your output by 3 watts a day, and over time that's going to increase, because at some point you'll be producing more watts than is physically you're capable of doing. But the idea of marginal gains stuck, and it's a really, really good way to describe the kind of signaling that happens between teams. So here's how it works. You set up an idea that allows people to understand what behavior looks like for that team. So in the Sky team, what they did was all these tiny little changes, these 1% changes as they called them. They said, you know what, we're going to paint all of the mechanics workshops and trucks white inside. We're going to do that because it's going to be so much easier to see where the grease is, where the stains are, and where the dirt is. And that way we'll be able to clean up a lot quicker. What they're really saying here is not that they want a clean environment, but that kind of attention to detail is important. And that signaling of behavior turns out to be a strategy for them. They also realize that, hell, we've got a whole bunch of really diverse people on the team, a lot of different people with a lot of different digestive systems. We should be making different food for them instead of just having them eat in some glorified canteen. So they hire a chef, and that chef writes a book about the different kinds of food for the different kinds of people on that team. Now, what's the signal there? It's not that, hey, we've got lots of money and we can hire a chef. The signal is, we care about each of you as individuals, and we recognize that you're all different. And by recognizing that you're different, we're signaling that it's okay to be different. It's okay to bring other different people into the group. They also told them to bring their own pillows and blankies. Why did they do that? Well, because a good night's sleep is the best performance enhancer you can have as an athlete. And as these teams are traveling around, they don't get a good night's sleep. I mean, I've just flown in from Boston and I'm sleeping in a hotel. I'm not getting a good night's sleep, and I don't even have a race tomorrow. So by giving them the opportunity to bring their own pillows and other things that comfort them, they're signaling to them, your peace of mind is really important to us. So these are the guidelines and the guardrails that companies need to put in place to signal to the rest of the team what's important. You're not saying that pillows are important. You're saying that a good night's sleep is important. You're not saying that having a chef is important. You're saying that diversity in everything is important. You're signaling across the organization. And I challenge you to think about, what are the things in your organization that you can do to signal to the rest of your team or to your entire company that something is important? And it's not putting a sign up on the wall, and it's not printing out a poster. It's signaling in a very subtle way. I want to show you a video of a Formula One racing team changing tires. Now, at the very top, you'll see a pair of green or lime green gloves reach down. Somebody's reaching down and they see a little bit of dirt, they see another little piece of dirt. Now, nobody's telling that guy to take the dirt off the track. There's no sign there, there's no boss looking over your shoulder saying, you have to do these things. And yet, in a couple of seconds, they're able to do their job and then walk away without anybody pointing and shouting. There's no shouting. There's just this delicate dance. And if you imagine that for a second, what are the delicate ways that you can show your organization that you're a team? Well, you do that by signaling what's important. And the final thing that we saw these amazing teams do is that they had a very, very clear idea of where they were going. And they were signaling that as well. So, it's 1962. JFK is at Rice University, and he's decided that we're going to the moon. And not everybody's excited about that, right? You would imagine that everybody would be like, yeah, this is great. We're all going to the moon. We've all got something to work towards. But it was actually quite divisive. There were people in the crowd who just didn't agree with him, right? They thought, this is stupid. This is a waste of money. We should be doing other things. Just like most politicians have this argument almost every day. But what he was looking for is something to unify the nation around and signal to the rest of the American public and to the world that this is where we're going. We care to do this thing. And in the speech that he gave at Rice University in 1962, this is probably the most memorable part of the speech, because this is the inspiring part. This is the part that got people kind of, yeah, we're going to the moon, we're excited, we're Americans, we do hard things. But if you read the entire speech, the really, really cool stuff is a little bit further on. And this is the stuff that we keep seeing at these high-performance organizations. Yes, they have inspirational talks. Yes, they have an inspirational and charismatic leader. But what they do is they try and figure out how to organize people's energy. They're constantly thinking about, how do we send the signals and create safe spaces so that people can apply their energies and their skills in the best possible way? This speech is really a good reminder of the fact that you need both that inspiration and you need an organizing capacity to be able to do that. And in thinking about that, you have to think about the fact that having a mission, having an inspirational mission, is a little bit different from having a product vision. So here is a classified ad from Sir Ernest Shackleton when he went to Antarctica. This is also pretty divisive. You either read this and you go, I'm signing up, I want to go on this trip. Or you go, there's no frickin' way I'm going on this trip, right? There's no ways. And if that's your reaction, then he's done his job. He has divided those people who need to be on that journey from those people who don't want to be on that journey. So a vision has to be something different from that mission, right? It has to be something that you can see, you can imagine immediately on seeing that. And part of that is that it has to be something that's built into the structure of the organization. So let's take a quick look at this because I'm running out of time. But the executive is very often thought to be the place where the mission and vision and the product vision, all that stuff happens. But what we noticed is that, yeah, if there's a product group that doesn't have anything, then it'll drift down. There'll be some help. The company's executives will say, we think we're going in this direction. And so this idea will percolate through the organization. But in these very mature, interesting, high-performing companies, the product vision lives separately from the mission. The product vision comes up from the customer, goes through that product group, and the product group actually owns it. Nate, here's a quote from you. Very similar to what you heard from JFK, right? It's not process. We never went to an organization and they sat us down and said, we can't wait to tell you about Agile. Never once. They never once told us about their technology. If you read the book, very, very few people talk about technology and process, but what they talk about is how to organize people in an adaptable environment. So when you look at mission statements, they're crazy ideas that take you far off, but they're also independent of the product vision. And this is the big deal. The vision of the product lives separately from the mission of the company. Here's another good example of that. 2 more minutes. There's a new book out by Scott Belsky called The Messy Middle. And the reason why you need these very strong visions and a very clear mission is because things are going to get bad, right? This is what he imagines the world would look like, but in reality, it's a lot more like that, right? It just gets really, really, really shitty in the middle. And this is the truth. Like, every good idea has to go through this. And so having a clear mission, having a clear vision, allows your team that safety to say, hey, you know what? I know things are going to get bad, but we've got a way to get through this bad, and we know what it's going to look like on the other side because we've got the right team, we're sending the right signals to each other. So the moral of this story is psychological safety isn't covering people in cotton wool. It's not putting up health and safety signs everywhere. It's not protecting people from each other. Rather, it's providing a big challenge, a scary idea that they can work towards, knowing that they're going to be safe in pursuing that challenge, and knowing that if they fall, they don't have far to fall because the people around them will catch them. Thank you.